The modern seeker stands at the precipice of an abyss that previous generations could scarcely imagine. In an age where information flows like water, yet wisdom remains scarce as gold, the ancient art of alchemy emerges not as superstitious chemistry, but as a sophisticated psychological technology for navigating personal and civilizational collapse. The Hermetic tradition, stretching from the shadowed temples of Hellenistic Egypt through the laboratories of medieval Europe to the consulting rooms of 20th-century depth psychology, offers a rigorous framework for transformation precisely when external certainties disintegrate. The foundational text of Western alchemy, the Emerald Tablet attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, declares a principle that resonates with peculiar urgency in our current moment. As above, so below, as within, so without. This is not mystical poetry, but operational instruction. The collapse witnessed in external structures, political, economic, ecological, mirrors and magnifies the internal fragmentation of the contemporary psyche. Dennis William Hawke, in his exhaustive analysis of the Emerald Tablet's influence, demonstrates how this single axiom became the organizing principle for centuries of Western esoteric practice, uniting cosmology with psychology, matter with spirit, outer work with inner transformation. The Corpus Hermeticum, those dialogues between Hermes and his disciples, compiled in the early centuries of the Common Era, established alchemy not merely as proto-chemistry, but as a complete initiatory system. These texts influenced Paracelsus, who in the 16th century revolutionized medicine by insisting that the physician must first become an alchemist of the soul before treating the body. Later, Eliphas Levi would synthesize these traditions with Kabbalah, creating a systematic framework that Manly Palmer Hall would further elaborate in his encyclopedic works on esoteric philosophy. Carl Jung, drawing explicitly on these sources, recognized in alchemy a sophisticated symbolic language, describing the process of individuation, the painful, necessary work of becoming a complete human being. The Kybalion, though controversial in its origins, distilled Hermetic philosophy into 7 operational principles that function as diagnostic tools for understanding consciousness itself. These are not beliefs to adopt, but observable patterns to verify through direct experience. The true secret, then, is not hidden in dusty grimoires or arcane symbols, but in the willingness to undertake the most challenging expedition available to human consciousness. The journey into one's own psychological depths, there to confront, transmute, and integrate the raw material of the psyche. This is the alchemist's work, and it begins precisely where external certainties end. The alchemical tradition operates through a sophisticated symbolic architecture that maps both cosmic principles and psychological processes. At its foundation lie the 7 Hermetic principles articulated in the Kybalion: mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender. These are not mystical abstractions, but operational laws describing how consciousness structures reality. The first principle, mentalism, establishes the primacy of mind. The all is mind, the universe is mental, a position that aligns unexpectedly with contemporary quantum mechanics and cognitive science, both of which demonstrate the observer's role in constituting observed reality. The principle of correspondence provides the key methodology. Patterns repeat across scales. The structure of the atom mirrors the solar system. Psychological complexes mirror social pathologies. Personal transformation prefigures collective evolution. This fractal understanding of reality allows the alchemist to work at the scale of individual consciousness with confidence that such work has transpersonal implications. Vibration and polarity together describe the dynamic nature of all manifestation. Nothing is static. Everything oscillates between poles, and mastery consists in consciously adjusting one's position along these spectrums rather than being unconsciously thrown between extremes. Classical alchemy organizes its work through stages traditionally designated by color: Nigredo, blackening; Albedo, whitening; Citrinitas, yellowing; and Rubedo, reddening. These phases correspond to psychological states that any serious practitioner will encounter, But alchemy also employs a triadic framework inherited from ancient philosophy: sulfur, mercury, and salt, representing spirit, soul, and body respectively, or in psychological terms will, imagination, and embodied action. The interaction of these three produces the fourth, the philosopher's stone, which represents integrated consciousness itself. The connection with Kabbalah becomes evident when examining the structure of transformation. Both systems recognize that consciousness operates through distinct levels or worlds, and that ascent requires systematic work at each level. The Kabbalistic tree of life, with its 10 spheres, Sephiroth, connected by 22 paths, maps onto alchemical processes with remarkable precision. The descent into Malkuth, kingdom, the material world, corresponds to the alchemical Nigredo. The ascent through the middle pillar mirrors the whitening and purification of Albedo. The achievement of Tifereth, beauty, the integrated self, represents the alchemical goal of the unified being. Neoplatonism, particularly as articulated by Plotinus and later synthesized by Renaissance Hermeticists like Marsilio Ficino, provides the philosophical foundation. The doctrine of emanation, that all things flow from a transcendent one and seek return to that source, parallels the alchemical understanding that base matter contains divine potential awaiting liberation. The Neoplatonic emphasis on contemplative ascent through progressive purification of consciousness directly influenced the meditative practices of Christian mystics, Islamic Sufis, and Jewish Kabbalists, all of whom contributed to the rich synthesis that became Western esotericism. Rosicrucianism, that mysterious movement announced in early 17th century manifestos, crystallized many of these streams into a coherent initiatory framework. The Rosicrucian emphasis on spiritual alchemy, inner transformation preceding outer action, and the role of the adept as physician to a sick civilization established a model that influenced virtually every subsequent Western esoteric order. The chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz presents the alchemical journey as a series of initiatory trials requiring intellectual, moral, and spiritual capacities in integration. The mentality required of the adept in this tradition is rigorously demanding. It requires what ceremonial magicians call the magical will, not mere desire or intention, but a unified capacity for sustained attention and deliberate action aligned with one's deepest understanding. This will must be combined with what Eliphas Levi termed the equilibrium of forces, a moral and psychological balance preventing the practitioner from being overwhelmed by the energies contacted during the work. The occultist ethic is not moralistic prohibition, but functional necessity. Certain states of consciousness are unstable and dangerous without a foundation of character. Perhaps most importantly, authentic practice requires a disposition toward doubt, not the corrosive skepticism that refuses all experience, but the discriminating intelligence that questions every conclusion, tests every revelation against experience, and remains willing to revise understanding in light of new evidence. The true adept is neither credulous believer nor cynical materialist, but an empirical investigator of consciousness, willing to pursue evidence wherever it leads. This epistemological humility, combined with methodological rigor, distinguishes genuine esotericism from both religious fundamentalism and pseudo-scientific credulity. The alchemical journey begins not with transcendence, but with descent. The stage called Nigredo, the blackening, represents the necessary dissolution of false structures, the confrontation with shadow, and the experience of psychological death. In Jungian terms, this corresponds to the encounter with the personal unconscious and the beginning of shadow work. The alchemist must first acknowledge and confront those aspects of self that have been repressed, denied, or projected onto others. This is not abstract philosophical reflection, but lived experience, the moment when carefully constructed self-images collapse, when the gap between who one believes oneself to be and who one actually is becomes impossible to ignore. The psychological manifestation of Nigredo in the modern psyche often appears as depression, but a depression with a distinct quality. Unlike clinical depression that flattens affect and drains meaning, the alchemical Nigredo intensifies experience while stripping away comforting illusions. It is the dark night of the soul that mystics describe, the necessary putrefaction that precedes regeneration. Jung observed that his patients often entered analysis during a Nigredo phase. Their previous adaptive strategies had failed, their relationships had collapsed, their careers had lost meaning. But rather than pathologizing this state, Jung recognized it as potentially the beginning of genuine development. The adept in this stage must resist the temptation to escape prematurely. Modern culture offers countless methods of avoidance: pharmaceutical suppression of symptoms, distraction through entertainment, spiritual bypassing through premature transcendence claims, or the false resolution of finding external enemies to blame for internal fragmentation. The alchemical texts insist on staying with the disintegration, observing the process, and extracting the essence that survives decomposition. This requires extraordinary courage, because it means voluntarily remaining in psychological states that every instinct urges us to flee. During Nigredo, the alchemist encounters what Jung termed the shadow archetype, not merely personal failings, but the archetypal capacity for evil, destruction, and unconsciousness that exists in all humans. The psychological work here involves neither identifying with the shadow, descending into nihilistic amorality, nor repressing it, maintaining inflated self-righteousness, but recognizing it as a part of the total psyche that must be integrated. Medieval alchemical texts represented this stage with images of death, rotting corpses, black ravens, and descent into underground chambers. These were not morbid fantasies, but accurate symbolic representations of psychological states. The transition to albedo, the whitening, occurs when the dissolution has proceeded far enough that a new foundation can be established. This stage represents purification, the separation of essential from accidental, and the emergence of a more authentic selfhood. Psychologically, this corresponds to what Jung called the withdrawal of projections. The practitioner begins to recognize how much of their external experience has been constituted by internal psychological content projected outward. The external enemy is revealed as an inner complex. The idealized lover is recognized as an anima or animus projection. The perfect guru is seen as an externalized self-archetype. Albedo involves rigorous intellectual and imaginative work. The alchemist must develop what Henry Corbin called the imaginal faculty, a capacity for symbolic perception that is neither concrete literalism nor mere fantasy, but an organ for perceiving the subtle dimensions of reality. This stage requires extensive study, meditation, and inner dialogue. The alchemical texts speak of philosophical meditation and circulation, repeated cycles of solving and coagulating, dissolving conceptual certainties and reformulating understanding at higher levels of integration. The psychological work of albedo includes encountering the anima for men, or animus for women, Jung's terms for the contrasexual archetypal image that mediates between ego and unconscious. This encounter, when authentic, destabilizes conventional gender identifications and reveals a more complex psychological truth. Every psyche contains both masculine and feminine principles in dynamic interaction. The integration of this contrasexual aspect is essential for psychological wholeness. Many spiritual traditions represent this as sacred marriage, the union of opposites, or in alchemical terms, the conjunction of sol and lunar, sun and moon, masculine and feminine principles. Albedo also involves confronting what Jung called inflation, the danger of identifying ego with self, mistaking a psychological achievement for complete realization. This is the stage where many seekers become trapped in spiritual narcissism, convinced they have achieved enlightenment when they have merely glimpsed possibility. The alchemical texts warn against premature claims to have achieved the stone. The genuine adept maintains what Buddhists call beginner's mind, recognizing that each level of understanding reveals previously unsuspected depths. The stage, sometimes designated Citrinitas, the yellowing, represents the dawning of solar consciousness, the emergence of individuated identity that is neither ego-bound nor unconsciously merged with collective. This is the psychological birth of what Jung termed the self with a capital S, the archetype of wholeness that transcends and includes ego consciousness. In alchemical symbolism, this appears as the birth of the divine child, the philosopher's child, or the philosophical gold that emerges from the union of purified opposites. Psychologically, Citrinitas manifests as a new relationship to consciousness itself. The practitioner develops what might be called meta-awareness, the capacity to observe one's own psychological processes without being completely identified with them. This is not dissociation, but integration at a higher level. There is still personality, still emotion, still engagement with the world, but no longer the unconscious compulsion that characterized earlier stages. The Stoic philosophers described something similar as apatheia, not the absence of feeling, but the absence of being overwhelmed by feeling. In this stage, the relationship with archetypal content shifts. Rather than being possessed by archetypal energies, the hero, the victim, the sage, the rebel, the individuated person can consciously engage with these patterns, neither identifying with them nor repressing them. This is what Jung meant by making the unconscious conscious, not eliminating unconscious processes, which is impossible, but establishing a relationship between conscious ego and the deeper layers of psyche. The final stage, Rubedo, the reddening, represents the return to the world with integrated consciousness. This is not transcendence that leaves the world behind, but incarnation that brings realized consciousness into embodied action. The alchemical texts speak of the multiplication of the stone, the capacity of realized consciousness to catalyze transformation in others through presence and example rather than through proselytizing or technique. Psychologically, Rubedo corresponds to what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming truly oneself, while simultaneously recognizing one's place in the larger whole of humanity. This paradoxical achievement dissolves the false dichotomy between individual and collective, spiritual and material, transcendent and immanent. The individuated person functions more effectively in the world precisely because they are less driven by unconscious compensation and projection. The Rubedo stage manifests as what some traditions call crazy wisdom, behavior that appears paradoxical or even contradictory to conventional morality, but which arises from a deeper ethical understanding. This is dangerous territory, easily confused with simple license or narcissistic justification of selfish behavior. The genuine mark is whether actions serve the larger good, even when they violate conventional propriety. Zen Buddhism has a rich tradition of such figures. Western alchemy tends to emphasize the hidden philosopher who works silently rather than calling attention to achievement. The completion of the great work produces what the texts call the philosopher's stone or the elixir of life. In psychological terms, this represents a state of consciousness characterized by several qualities: the capacity to hold paradox and contradiction without collapsing into binary thinking, compassion that arises from recognizing one's own capacity for evil, genuine humility that comes from understanding how little one truly controls, and a sense of meaning that persists even in the face of suffering and absurdity. This is not permanent bliss or transcendence of all problems, but a fundamental shift in one's relationship to existence itself. The deepest crisis of the alchemical journey occurs at the threshold between Nigredo and Albedo, in what the texts call the mortificatio, the psychological death that must precede rebirth. This is not metaphorical hyperbole, but accurate description of a state in which the familiar self-structure actually disintegrates, leaving consciousness without its customary organizing principles. The mystics called it the dark night of the soul. Existentialists termed it the encounter with the void. Depth psychologists recognize it as the ego's confrontation with its own contingency and constructed nature. This crisis differs fundamentally from ordinary depression or anxiety, though it may include both. Clinical depression typically involves a flattening of affect, loss of interest, and withdrawal from engagement. The alchemical crisis, by contrast, intensifies experience while stripping it of meaning structures. Colors become more vivid even as their significance dissolves. Relationships are felt more acutely, even as their foundations seem arbitrary. Existence itself presses in with overwhelming immediacy while revealing its groundlessness. This is why traditional diagnostic categories often fail to capture this state. It is simultaneously pathological by conventional standards and potentially transformative by esoteric ones. The philosophical distinction here is crucial. In modernity, suffering is typically understood as symptom requiring elimination. The entire apparatus of contemporary psychology and psychiatry aims at restoring function, reducing symptoms, and returning the person to normal activity. This is not wrong. Genuine pathology exists and requires treatment. But the esoteric traditions recognized a different category: teleological suffering, pain that serves a purpose in development. Just as physical pain signals necessary information about bodily damage, psychological anguish can signal necessary information about existential or spiritual crisis. The ancient mystery religions institutionalized this understanding through initiatory ordeals, carefully structured experiences of psychological death designed to precipitate transformation. The Eleusinian mysteries, the Mithraic initiations, the shamanic dismemberment experiences found across cultures. These were not sadistic rituals, but sophisticated technologies for inducing controlled ego dissolution under conditions that would allow subsequent reintegration at a higher level of organization. Modernity, having largely abandoned such structures, leaves individuals to undergo these crises without cultural container or interpretive framework. During the mortificatio, the adept confronts what existentialists called the facticity of existence, the brute, given, arbitrary nature of one's particular life circumstances. This includes not only the accidents of birth, body, family, and culture, but also the fundamental structure of human existence itself: finitude, mortality, the inability to achieve absolute certainty, the inevitability of suffering. Kierkegaard described the sickness unto death that arises when consciousness fully grasps its situation. Heidegger analyzed the anxiety that emerges when being confronts its own being toward death. But the esoteric crisis goes deeper than existential philosophy typically penetrates. It involves not merely intellectual recognition of mortality and meaninglessness, but visceral, embodied, total confrontation with what the Buddhists call shunyata and Christian mystics termed the divine darkness. This is the experience of consciousness recognizing its own groundlessness, the absence of any secure foundation for knowledge, meaning, or identity. The carefully constructed self is revealed as a useful fiction. Beliefs are seen as adopted strategies. Personality itself appears as arbitrary constellation of habits and responses. The temptation at this point is overwhelming, to retreat into nihilism, to conclude that if nothing has inherent meaning, then nothing matters, to embrace a corrosive cynicism that denies value to forestall further disappointment. Many seekers founder here, either regressing to conventional certainties or hardening into bitter superiority. The alchemical texts warn explicitly about this danger, representing it as the blackening that can lead to permanent calcification rather than temporary dissolution. The alternative requires what can only be called faith, though not religious faith in the conventional sense. It is faith in the process itself, trust that disintegration can lead to reintegration, confidence based on the testimony of those who have traveled this path before, that meaning can emerge from meaninglessness, that order can arise from chaos, that the void is pregnant rather than merely empty. This faith must be combined with radical honesty, refusing both to deny the genuine crisis and to escape prematurely into false solutions. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what Jung called enantiodromia, the tendency of any psychological content taken to an extreme to convert into its opposite. The complete disillusionment with constructed meaning creates the possibility for discovering authentic meaning. The total dissolution of false self creates space for genuine self to emerge. The descent into darkness makes possible the recognition of light. But this conversion is not automatic. It requires the alchemist to remain conscious during the process, to observe without identifying, to maintain a thread of awareness even when everything familiar has dissolved. The great danger of this stage is what the texts call spiritual death, a state in which the psyche becomes so identified with disintegration that it cannot reconstitute. This manifests clinically as certain forms of psychosis or catatonia, existentially as abiding nihilism, spiritually as what mystics called acedia, or the demon of noontide, a flat, empty despair that lacks even the energy for grief. The boundary between transformative crisis and genuine pathology is not always clear, which is why traditional systems insisted on guidance from those who had successfully navigated the territory. What carries the adept through this crisis is not strength in the conventional sense, but a particular kind of surrender, what the mystics called abandonment to divine will, what Buddhists term non-attachment, what depth psychology recognizes as acceptance of unconscious processes. This is not passive resignation, but active receptivity, a willingness to not know, to remain in uncertainty, to trust that something knows even when ego does not. It requires dying to the compulsion to control, the need to understand, the demand for security, and yet maintaining sufficient awareness to integrate whatever emerges. The completion of the alchemical work produces a state that the tradition designates variously as the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, the achievement of the great work, or simply gold. In psychological terms, this represents what Jung called the realized self, a stable configuration of consciousness that has integrated both personal unconscious contents and established functional relationship with the collective unconscious. This is not a static achievement, but a dynamic capacity, not a destination reached, but a quality of being maintained through ongoing practice. The philosopher's stone, understood symbolically rather than literally, represents consciousness that has achieved several interlocking capacities. First, psychological flexibility, the ability to move between different modes of awareness without being trapped in any single perspective. The adept can engage rational analysis when appropriate, feel emotion deeply without being overwhelmed, access intuitive knowing without abandoning critical judgment, and maintain contemplative awareness throughout all activities. This fluidity contrasts sharply with the rigid either-or thinking characteristic of unconscious psychology. Second, the integrated person has developed what might be called ontological security, a fundamental trust in existence that persists despite uncertainty, suffering, and the absence of absolute guarantees. This is not naive optimism or denial of genuine darkness, but a recognition that meaning and value can be created and discovered even in the face of meaninglessness and evil. The existential ground shifts from external validation to internal authenticity. One no longer needs the world to conform to desires in order to affirm life itself. Third, the work produces ethical clarity arising from self-knowledge rather than external authority. Having confronted one's own capacity for unconsciousness, cruelty, and self-deception, the adept develops genuine compassion that includes rather than excludes the darkness in self and others. Morality shifts from rule-following or calculation of consequences to spontaneous right action arising from integrated understanding. This is what Confucian philosophy termed the rectified heart-mind, what Aristotle called practical wisdom, what the alchemists referred to as operating in accordance with nature. The individuated person maintains what Buddhists call the bodhisattva vow, the commitment to remain engaged with the world for the benefit of all beings, even after achieving personal liberation. In alchemical terms, this is the multiplication of the stone, the recognition that realized consciousness naturally seeks to catalyze transformation in others. But this occurs through presence and example rather than through proselytizing or technique. The adept becomes what Taoism calls the useless tree, appearing ordinary, while embodying extraordinary capacity, functioning without calling attention to function. For the modern practitioner, this integration manifests in several practical domains. In relationship, the individuated person can maintain intimacy without fusion, autonomy without isolation, loving without attachment to specific outcomes. In work, there emerges creative engagement that serves both personal fulfillment and collective need, productivity without drivenness, achievement without identification. In the face of social and ecological collapse, the integrated consciousness maintains both clear-eyed assessment of crisis and sustained commitment to meaningful action, neither denying catastrophe nor collapsing into paralyzing despair. The responsibility accompanying this state cannot be overstated. The alchemical texts insist that knowledge confers obligation. Those who have achieved integration bear responsibility for its expression and transmission. This is not missionary zeal or superiority complex, but simple recognition that capacity creates duty. The physician who has learned to heal must heal. The philosopher who has discovered wisdom must teach. The alchemist who has transmuted consciousness must serve the larger alchemical project of human development. But this service takes unexpected forms. The Hermetic principle of silence cautions against premature or inappropriate disclosure. Many genuine adepts remain unknown, working through influence rather than prominence, teaching through encounter rather than institution, transforming through presence rather than program. The esoteric schools maintained that certain knowledge could only be transmitted person to person, in contexts allowing verification through direct experience rather than mere belief. The discipline and rigor cultivated by the Hermetic school approach prove essential precisely because the work is so easily counterfeited. Psychological jargon can mask avoidance, spiritual language can justify narcissism, therapeutic process can become interminable self-absorption. The authentic work produces specific, observable, verifiable results, increased capacity for conscious suffering, expanded tolerance for complexity and ambiguity, spontaneous ethical behavior arising from integrated understanding, and a quality of presence that others recognize even when they cannot name it. This is why the tradition insists on testing, verification, and sustained practice rather than belief, enthusiasm, or peak experience. Genuine transformation reveals itself in ordinary life, in how one handles frustration, disappointment, and conflict, in whether one's actions align with stated values, in the quality of one's relationships and work, in whether consciousness remains available during difficulty or only during comfort. The alchemical gold is known by its incorruptibility. It maintains its nature under conditions that would degrade lesser metals. The ultimate fruition of the work is a human being who functions as what Gurdjieff called conscious man, one who can observe self and situation simultaneously, who acts from choice rather than compulsion, who maintains awareness during the full range of human experience, and who serves the evolution of consciousness through whatever means their particular gifts and circumstances provide. This is not superhuman achievement, but fully human development. The actualization of capacities latent in consciousness itself, but requiring deliberate cultivation through systematic work. The secrets that transform are not hidden in ancient texts or occult symbols, but in the courage to descend into one's own depths, there to discover that the void one feared was the pregnant darkness from which all authentic creation emerges. For the alchemist's ultimate realization is that gold was always present in the lead, waiting only for consciousness refined enough to recognize its own nature.